I want you to try a little experiment. Wherever you are right now, just close your eyes for a second and picture the burning of the Library of Alexandria. Take your time with it. Let the scene really build in your mind.
It's an incredibly vivid image for most people, I think, even if they aren't massive history buffs.
Exactly. You probably immediately see the torches, right? You see this massive, sort of cathedral-like stone hall.
Shelves stacked to the absolute ceiling.
Yeah, shelves everywhere, scrolls curling into ash. Maybe there's a doomed scholar clutching an armful of manuscripts while Roman soldiers kick over the oil lamps. It plays out like a Hollywood blockbuster in our collective memory.
It really does. And it is a purely cinematic memory that we basically all share. It's passed down entirely through cultural osmosis.
But here's the bombshell to kick off this deep dive. That memory, that specific apocalyptic event, it never actually happened.
Which is staggering when you think about it. I mean, it is arguably the most famous catastrophe in the history of human knowledge, the ultimate symbol of lost civilization, and the whole fire aspect of it is almost entirely fiction.
To figure out what actually happened, we're diving into a phenomenal book today called The Burned Down Library, Alexandria, and the Fear of Forgetting, written by Peter Kriger.
It's such a brilliant read.
It really is. And the mission for our deep dive today is going to change how you look at the preservation of information. You see, Peter Kriger approaches history not like a dramatic storyteller looking for a villain, but almost like a systems analyst.
Right, trying to find a failure point in a network.
Exactly. He sets out to prove that the greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world wasn't destroyed by a catastrophic fire. It was destroyed by something so much more terrifying because of how mundane it is.
A simple accounting decision.
Just a budget cut. We are going to explore the mechanics of how knowledge actually dies. And more importantly, we're going to look at why the exact same invisible threat that took down Alexandria is currently eating away at your own digital life right now.
But to understand that threat, we first have to clear the name of the prime suspect in this historical murder mystery, Julius Caesar.
He is the one everyone points the finger at.
He is. And, I mean, it makes sense why they do, right? The timeline sort of fits. And we know for a fact he did set a fire in Alexandria in 48 BC.
Right. He was pinned down in a hostile city during an Egyptian civil war.
He was heavily outnumbered. And to prevent the Egyptian fleet from cutting off his escape route, he basically ordered his men to set fire to his own ships in the harbor.
A drastic move.
Very. The tactical maneuver worked, but the fire didn't stop at the water. It spread to the docks, and it burned down several waterfront warehouses. And here is where the legend starts. Because those warehouses did contain a massive amount of papyrus scrolls.
The ancient sources throw around a number of, 40,000 scrolls destroyed.
Yeah, around 40,000.
Okay, wait, 40,000 scrolls burning sounds exactly like the library being destroyed. I can completely see why people blame him.
Oh, absolutely.
But reading through the source material, this is where Peter Kriger totally flips the context. The actual Great Library, the institution itself, was located in the royal quarter of the city, safely inland, way away from the docks. Those 40,000 scrolls near the water, they were essentially export stock.
Exactly. You have to remember the economic reality of Alexandria at the time. It wasn't just the center of learning, it was the papyrus capital of the Mediterranean.
The absolute hub of the ancient book trade.
The undisputed hub.
Yeah.
So Caesar burning those docks, it wasn't the equivalent of burning down the Library of Congress.
It was more like an electrical fire at a massive Amazon fulfillment center.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. The warehouses held inventory awaiting shipment across the Mediterranean. It was a staggering financial loss for the merchants, sure, absolutely.
But not a fatal blow to human knowledge?
Right. They were mass-produced copies of texts the Alexandrian book trade already had plenty of masters for.
But if that's the case, why did ancient historians eventually pin the blame on this fire? I mean, how does a story grow from some commercial warehouses burned down to the entirety of human knowledge was incinerated in one afternoon?
Well, it comes down to how ancient historians operated, and frankly, the expectations of their audience. Later Roman writers were essentially connoisseurs of catastrophe.
They loved a good disaster.
Exactly. When Mount Vesuvius erupted, or when Rome burned under Nero, historians wrote volumes about the tragedy. They detailed the omens, the panic, the profound cultural loss. But when we look at contemporary sources alive during and immediately after Caesar's fire in Alexandria,
Crickets.
complete silence regarding the Great Library. No lamentations, no elegies for lost wisdom.
And in history, sometimes an absence of evidence is the strongest evidence you can get.
Precisely. It is highly suspicious. It was only over the centuries that much later writers started incorrectly connecting the dots. They knew Caesar started a fire, and they knew the Great Library didn't exist in their time anymore.
So they just merged the two events?
Yeah, they promoted a dock fire into a civilization-ending event, largely because they needed a dramatic climax to a story they didn't really understand themselves.
Which Peter Kriger proves by pointing to the actual paper trail left behind after Caesar left Egypt. We actually have records of a tourist who visited the institution decades later.
Yes, the Greek geographer Strabo. He visited Alexandria 28 years after Caesar's supposed apocalyptic fire.
And he literally walked through it, right?
He walked right through the Maution, which was the larger research institution that housed the Great Library. He doesn't describe a ruined, ash-covered husk.
Wow.
He describes a fully functioning elite institution. He mentions a massive dining hall, a beautiful covered walkway, and scholars actively working on a royal stipend.
And if a tourist review isn't enough proof of life, we have the legendary scholar Didymus, who, by the way, is my new favorite historical figure purely because of his nickname.
Oh, Didymus Bronze Guts.
Bronze Guts. It is arguably the greatest academic nickname in history.
He earned it too. They called him Bronze Guts because he had this iron-stomached, absolutely exhausting work ethic. He would just sit and work for hours on end.
Bronze Guts wrote an estimated 4,000 books. 4,000. And he was doing this a full generation after Caesar's fire.
This is a crucial piece of evidence that Peter Kriger highlights. You cannot write 4,000 books of synthesized scholarship out of thin air.
Right.
Bronze Guts wasn't writing original poetry, you know. He was a compiler. He was summarizing and analyzing centuries of earlier scholars' work on grammar and literature.
And the mechanics of that kind of scholarship require you to cross-reference multiple texts simultaneously.
You simply cannot do that work unless you have an intact, massively comprehensive reference library sitting right in front of you.
Exactly. You can't compile the ultimate encyclopedia of ancient thought if the encyclopedia burned down before you were born. So, if the fire didn't kill the library, we have to look somewhere else. And to find the real culprit, we have to understand the physical, chemical reality of ancient books.
This is where it gets fascinating.
Because a library back then was not a vault where you just locked precious things away in the dark.
Not at all. And this is where the popular imagination fails us. We tend to imagine ancient scrolls lasting forever, like they're carved into stone. But papyrus is a plant. It's dried reeds pressed together.
And biological matter rots.
Especially in a humid Mediterranean coastal city like Alexandria.
It's not just the humidity either, it's the physical stress of reading, right?
Exactly. Think about how a scroll functions. To read the end of a book, you have to physically unroll and re-roll the entire document. The cellulose fibers flex, they fray, they crack.
So just reading it destroys it.
Yeah. If a papyrus scroll is actively being used, being studied and debated by scholars, it becomes flakes of dust in a few centuries at best.
I never thought about that mechanical wear and tear. So if the medium is constantly decaying, a library can't just be a building full of shelves.
No. A library in the ancient world is essentially a payroll.
That concept completely shifted my perspective when reading this.
Peter Kriger does the math on this, and it is daunting. Let's say you have a relatively modest library of 50,000 scrolls, and let's be generous and say each one lasts 200 years before falling apart.
Okay, 200 years.
Just to keep your collection exactly the same size. Not growing, just standing still.
Huh.
You have to manually copy and replace 250 scrolls every single year, indefinitely.
Wow. You need a standing army of highly trained scribes. You need
Like-
raw materials, ink, administrators, and most importantly, you need expert supervisors deciding which decaying scrolls need to be prioritized for copying before they are lost forever.
You need massive sustained funding.
Okay, so if an ancient library is a payroll, it's not a vault of treasures, it's a SaaS subscription. It's software as a service.
I say.
The minute the host stops paying the massive monthly server costs, the service just evaporates. It doesn't blow up, it just degrades and vanishes.
And that is exactly what happened. The subscription was abruptly canceled in 145 BC.
Enter King Ptolemy VIII, also known by his flattering historical nickname, Potbelly.
King Potbelly took the throne and immediately wanted to settle some political scores. The intellectuals at the Great Library had supported his rival. So he purged them,
Just fired everybody.
revoked their stipends, and physically exiled the top scholars from Alexandria. And to add insult to injury, he gave the prestigious job of head librarian to a palace bodyguard named Cetus.
A literal palace guard. I'm assuming Cetus wasn't secretly a master of Greek literature.
He was a political loyalist,
Yeah.
and that is the exact moment the institution was mortally wounded. The scrolls didn't go up in smoke. They were sitting on the exact same shelves they were on the day before.
But Peter Kriger makes the argument that by removing the expertise, the specific people who knew what to copy, how to copy it, and how to manage that massive payroll, the budget essentially dried up.
The building looks completely fine on the outside, but it's doomed. It's silently rotting from the inside out because of a vindictive king, decaying reeds, and a bodyguard.
The maintenance cycle was broken, and once
Yeah.
you break the cycle of copying, the clock runs out very quickly. But that raises a massive question.
Right.
If the central hub of human knowledge was slowly rotting into dust, how did anything survive from the ancient world to reach us today?
That brings us to the fascinating and somewhat uncomfortable filter of history. Because the survival of ancient texts didn't depend on the elite scholars in Alexandria. It depended entirely on what everyday people out in the wider world chose to spend their own money to copy.
And Peter Kriger uses the rubbish heap at Oxyrhynchus to perfectly illustrate this.
The Oxyrhynchus dump is such an incredible archaeological story.
It really is. The best evidence we have for what the ancients actually read on a daily basis isn't found in a pristine marble archive. It's literally a massive garbage dump in a provincial Egyptian town.
It is the ultimate reality check for classical historians. The town of Oxyrhynchus had a climate so incredibly dry, and the sand covered everything so thoroughly, that the town's discarded paperwork just sat there for millennia and survived.
And when archaeologists finally excavated it, they found personal letters, tax receipts, and literature.
But the literature they found didn't reflect the absolute best of the ancient world. It reflected what was most actively taught.
Right, Homer completely dominates the trash heap.
Homer is everywhere. Why? Because the Iliad and the Odyssey were the absolute core of the Greek school curriculum. Every single child learning to read and write was forced to copy passages from Homer.
So if a text was on the syllabus, there was constant decentralized demand for it. There were thousands of copies floating around everywhere.
Exactly. But if a brilliant piece of literature wasn't actively taught in schools, it just vanished when the few existing copies eventually succumbed to the humidity.
It's a sobering thought. We like to assume that the texts that survived from antiquity were the absolute masterpieces, carefully filtered by generations of refined, objective good taste.
Yeah, we give ourselves too much credit.
But it's actually more like judging the entirety of 21st century literature, but the only evidence you have to go on is the assigned reading list from a high school English class. You'd think The Great Gatsby and To Kill a Mockingbird were the only books anyone ever wrote.
That is an uncomfortably accurate comparison. And Peter Kriger reveals something even more arbitrary about what survives, which he calls the alphabet accident.
The story of Euripides. This is where you realize how much of history is just pure blind luck.
Consider the three great Greek tragedians, Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides. Today, we only have 7 complete plays by Sophocles and 7 by Aeschylus, but we have 19 plays by Euripides.
19 is a huge difference.
Right. For centuries, scholars assumed this meant Euripides was vastly more popular, or his work was deemed significantly more important by later generations.
But then you look at the titles of those surviving Euripides plays.
Yes. If you look at them in Greek, 9 of those 19 plays start with consecutive letters of the Greek alphabet: epsilon, zeta, eta, theta, iota, kappa.
They're literally just alphabetical.
They survived not because of their profound merit, but because a single multi-volume boxed edition happened to make it through the bottleneck of the Middle Ages.
And the specific volume that survived just happened to contain that alphabetical block on the shelf. The plays starting with alpha through delta. Gone.
Gone forever. Their survival was dictated entirely by shelf position. Meanwhile, complex paradigm-shifting brilliance almost vanished completely because it wasn't popular enough to be copied widely.
Peter Kriger spends some time talking about Archimedes here, which is just a heartbreaking example.
Archimedes was centuries ahead of his time. He was working out mathematical concepts that were essentially the precursor to modern calculus, almost 2,000 years before Isaac Newton.
But his masterwork, the method of mechanical theorems, almost didn't make it to us. And the reason why requires understanding a massive shift in how books were made.
Because eventually, the ancient world transitioned from papyrus to parchment.
Which is a much more durable material, but incredibly expensive. Parchment is made from animal skins, usually sheep or goats.
You have to flay the animal, treat the skin, stretch it, and scrape it clean. To produce a single large book, you might need an entire flock of sheep.
The material cost was astronomical. So, in the 13th century, a scribe needed some parchment to write a Christian prayer book. He didn't have fresh parchment, but he had this old, incredibly dense mathematical text lying around that nobody in his monastery understood.
So it took the Archimedes text, took a knife, and literally scraped the precursor to calculus off the pages so he could reuse the expensive animal skin.
He created a
A
palimpsest,
palimpsest, exactly. A manuscript page that's been scraped or washed off so it can be used again.
a completely routine, cost-saving administrative decision almost deleted the greatest mathematical mind of the ancient world. We only have it because modern imaging technology can read the faint indentations of the scraped-off math underneath the prayers.
When we pull back and look at the bigger picture here, it forces us to confront a bizarre irony. The tragedy of Alexandria's defunding, the event that broke the central hub of knowledge, actually triggered the only preservation method that works in the long run.
Decentralized replication. I was really hoping you'd bring this up because I had to read this section twice. Are we saying that King Potbelly, the villain who ruined the greatest library in history and put a bodyguard in charge, actually saved ancient knowledge by kicking everyone out?
Unintentionally, yes. He is the accidental savior of Western literature because when he purged the scholars, they didn't just give up and stop working, they fled
They dispersed across the Mediterranean.
to places like Cyprus, Rhodes, and Athens. And Peter Kriger notes that when they fled, they took the highly advanced Alexandrian methods of editing, cross-referencing, and copying of them.
By forcing them out, Potbelly converted a highly fragile, centralized system into a robust, distributed network.
Exactly. The central server went down, but the nodes had already scattered. Survival depended on moving the texts to places where there was fresh demand and fresh money to pay scribes.
If we fast forward a few centuries, we see this decentralized model save knowledge again, right?
Absolutely. The Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad funded massive translation movements, converting Greek texts into Arabic.
But they didn't do it out of mere curiosity. They needed practical, actionable knowledge.
Precisely. They needed astronomy to calculate lunar calendars for religious observance. They needed Greek medicine for their doctors. They needed engineering. So they essentially restarted the Alexandrian payroll, but under new management and in a new language.
And Charlemagne did the exact same thing for Latin literature in Europe during the Carolingian Renaissance.
He did. It proves that redundancy only works if it tracks popularity and active use. Passive storage, just locking a book in a dark room, doesn't work.
The ancients accidentally invented peer-to-peer file sharing.
They absolutely did. A text survives because a customer, whether a teacher in Egypt, a doctor in Baghdad, an administrator in Aachen, demands a fresh copy.
Which brings this entire historical deep dive right to our own doorstep. We look back and judge the ancients for letting their papyrus rot, or for scraping off Archimedes. But Peter Kriger points out that we are making the exact same centralized mistakes right now.
We really are.
And because of our technology, we are making them way, way faster.
It's a terrifying paradox. Today, the physical act of copying a digital file is instantaneous and essentially free. Yet, we are actually losing information at a faster rate than the ancient world did.
Wow.
Peter Kriger points out 3 modern failures that are equivalent of rotting papyrus. First is link rot.
Oh, anyone who has ever tried to find an old article knows this pain. You click a URL from 5 years ago, and it just goes to a 404 error page.
The server was moved or the domain registration expired. It's just gone.
The second failure is format decay, right? The medium outlasts the machine needed to read it.
He uses the brilliant example of the 1986 BBC Doomsday Project. This was a massive multimedia undertaking to document life in the UK, put onto highly advanced laser discs.
Cutting-edge technology at the time.
But within just 15 years, the project was almost completely unreadable. The specific hardware players broke down, the proprietary software became obsolete, it was trapped.
Meanwhile, the original 11th century Doomsday Book, written by hand on animal parchment, is still perfectly readable in the National Archives today.
Exactly. And the third modern failure is centralized deletion.
This is the SaaS subscription model turning on us.
A platform shuts down, a tech company gets acquired and changes its business model, and millions of user files, photos, and documents are wiped out in a single afternoon.
I want you listening to think about a folder of photos you haven't opened since 2009 sitting on a dead laptop in your closet. We think the cloud is a permanent magic vault. But the cloud is just somebody else's computer. It's a digital papyrus.
It is.
If Google or Apple stops paying their server cooling bills or decides your free account isn't profitable anymore, your memories crumble instantly.
We have willingly returned to the Alexandrian model. We are placing the entirety of the world's knowledge in the hands of a few massive organizations that are entirely reliant on subscription revenues and corporate budgets.
If centralization is such a trap, what is our modern equivalent of the scholars fleeing Alexandria? How do we disperse the knowledge today before the modern King Potbelly cuts the budget?
Well, there are actually initiatives trying to solve this using the exact lessons learned from antiquity. For instance, there's a system used by academic libraries called the LOCHSS initiative.
Lots of copies keep stuff safe.
Exactly. It's a brilliant peer-to-peer network where university libraries maintain their own local decentralized copies of academic journals and data. But they don't just store them passively.
What do they do?
The nodes on the network constantly communicate with each other, checking the cryptographic hashes of their files.
So they are actively auditing each other's homework.
Yes. And if one library's copy gets corrupted by a failing hard drive, the other nodes on the network notice the mismatch and automatically send a fresh, uncorrupted copy to repair it.
That's incredible.
It assumes that decay is a constant, inevitable threat, and it builds continuous, decentralized repair into its normal operation, just like the ancient book trade.
Okay, let's pull all of this together. The core takeaway from Peter Kriger's The Burned Down Library is a massive shift in how we view history. Fire is an event. You can point at a fire. You can blame a villain like Caesar. You can feel a sense of dramatic, tragic loss.
But a budget cut is a quiet, continuous decision.
Nobody writes an epic poem about a supervisor deciding not to renew the copying contract.
Preservation is not a passive state. It is a verb. It is constant action. It requires active work, demanding resources and attention in every single generation, just to carry knowledge forward one more step. It does not happen by accident.
And you, listening right now, you are the chief scribe. You are the copyist of your own life. If you aren't actively migrating your photos, your work, and your memories onto new drives and new formats, you are actively letting the papyrus rot.
But before we go, Peter Kriger leaves us with one final, fascinating case study that completely flips our intuition about preservation on its head.
The paradox of the Aleppo Codex.
The Aleppo Codex is generally regarded by scholars as the most authoritative surviving manuscript of the Hebrew Bible. It is a profoundly important document. And for 600 years, a community in Syria kept this vital manuscript perfectly safe.
But they didn't do it through decentralized copying.
No, they did the exact opposite.
Yeah.
They protected it by locking it in a secure chest in a crypt. They enforced absolute secrecy.
They refused to let almost anyone examine it.
They wouldn't let anyone copy it, and later they refused to let anyone photograph it.
In their minds, they were being the ultimate protectors. They were keeping the most precious thing they had completely safe from the world.
They were. But when a riot finally hit the city in 1947, the synagogue was attacked and burned. And because of their strict security, because they never allowed anyone to make a distributed copy, when 40% of the codex vanished in the chaos, there were no backups anywhere on Earth to reconstruct it from.
The missing pages were just gone.
Gone forever.
So we want to leave you with this paradox to mull over. We live in an era where we protect our most valuable information through heavy encryption, corporate secrecy, closed ecosystems, and locked digital vaults. But by isolating our data so thoroughly, are we actually guaranteeing its permanent destruction the very moment the server bills finally go unpaid?